Hi there, Joel here from cosinesound.com.au. Thanks for joining me today. In this video, we'll look at how to synthesize awesome airplane and propeller sounds, fan Doppler effects, and the tricks I used. Let's have a look. So, there you go, took you on a bit of a ride there. There's some very simple techniques we can use. We'll start with the main wave shape that I used here. I used this wave to create a louder saw wave with more contrast in the phasing, which is very characteristic of airplane propellers. It was also to approach a pulse wave shape, so you might notice it's not entirely a pulse wave. And this is really a personal preference. However, Andy Farnell explains that a pulse wave can be heard for each independent propeller, and we'll get back to that in another video. Taking out the low end here, so the low, about 5 harmonics have been dropped about 20 dB almost. That's really significant. I mean, that's like rolling off the low end. And I did that because when we have a full saw wave, we have very sort of blocky wave, and it's really not very organic. Whereas if we just flatten the low end a bit, you'll see what happens is the wave thins out a little bit. And if you want to learn a bit more about the slope there, you can check out the powerful bass video I did. Now that is 3 oscillators. But what else is important is that it doesn't sound muddy and it's not a very boomy sound as well. So we can fix that up in the source wave and create almost a pulse shape, which as it approaches a very skewed shape like this, it does tend to have a sort of Doppler sound to it. So one of these voices represents a single blade passing. So when the propeller turns, we have a single chop sound. And so you could think of these as, you could picture that every voice represents a propeller. So the more voices you have, generally, you know, the more propellers and the bigger the plane sound will be, and the more cloudy and muddy the sound will be as well. But once the voices are dropped and the detuning drops as well, we have a very sort of proximate sound and a very clear sound. So once it's a more sort of static, you know, fixed pitch and not so much a unison pitch, when it runs through the Waveshaper, it's very sort of proximate sounding. Like that sounds very much like it's, you know, recorded in a studio or something. Like it's a very sort of proximate, clear sound. Whereas as you add more voices, it sounds like a bigger plane, and it may also sound like it's further away at the same time. So if you use fewer voices, you'll generally create the sound of a smaller plane that has fewer blades and fewer propellers. And the larger it gets, obviously the bigger the sound as well, the more sort of a chorus effect that it creates. Now, one of these oscillators, which is it's not very essential, but because I have 3 oscillators, I added one of them with a Waveshaper to compress the sound, and that is sort of compressing it as it's phasing. So instead of getting this strong peaks and troughs, it'll just run through this very much like a consistent sound that is just bumped up the harmonics as well. I'll just take that away for a second. The third channel is a white noise oscillator. If you want to know more about that module, I've done a video on generating white noise in Absynth. You can check that out. The second module, luckily we can run this through ring modulation to modulate the amplitude, and we can do it at the same rate as the oscillator by tuning it to transposition or tuning it per note. And we can also use the same oscillator wave shape. So as you can see here, this is used by a mod C1, and it's also used by the other oscillators. So we get the exact same modulation happening. After that, we can also give a resonant sort of filter on that. So just a slight resonance on the sound. We can increase it even more to a whistling. So that's really cool to have that separate. Create all kinds of bizarre, different effects. Not to mention that the wind it's not a very prominent sound, but it's not actually very loud once the propeller overtakes it. So it's mainly used for the lower levels, so when the pitch drops down at a slower speed, we can hear that whooshing past. So yeah, once the propeller actually goes faster, it becomes extremely loud, and you don't really need to hear the wind as much in that part. So it doesn't need a very strong level. You can just mix it a few dBs lower. We mainly hear it in this case when the propeller is tuned to slow down, and we want the sound to sound close proximity, we can have that noise there. The next part is the Waveshaper. The wavetable is actually called Woodwind, so this is supposed to be part of a woodwind instrument, but basically it is a bright but organic sounding wave. It's experimental, and it depends on what kind of blade sound you want and how aggressive you want it to sound. I've chosen this because luckily it does work very well. It's a very bright sound, and it's not very digital sounding, so we don't get really any crazy sort of glitchy distortion. It's just more like organic, dirty distortion. Another reason why I like the Waveshaper is because it's part of Absynth, but also because we can move the phase around. Because the distortion is dependent here on the phase. You can hear, for example, if I change it to a sine wave, it sounds more like an overdriven sound, as though it's affecting the fundamental frequency. So your digital sounding distortion is something like stair step. Or square. So the Vox ones and the Woodwind and organs work really well. And waveshaping is non-linear distortion, so I mean it's a very interesting procedure that I'd like to explore later. This patch is a lot clearer than one of my first experiments, which was done in Aviator Part 1, the ambient music track. So the first thing is that we've got that feedback pushing in this inharmonic wavetable. It's a really metallic sounding wave and it's at a fixed frequency. So the base frequency is about 60 Hertz. But if I wanted to, I could tune that frequency shift to the actual propeller. Actually, I will need to apply it to the macro control. So if I just go to the macro control now, and it is mod master 2 pitch. I mean, that is one of the last things I did, really, just to give it an extra whistle on the end. Interestingly, I have applied the high pass filter to the macro control as well. So when the propeller is at a low frequency, we have a high pass, because otherwise it is quite muddy still when it goes through the filter. So this is the high pass on the Supercomb. This is just, just tweak it to taste. I mean, it's just to give perspective on the sound as though it's a flyby sound. It gives a lot of movement. It gives sort of grounded perspective because we have these sort of dips, as I've explained before. These dips, they just really give perspective as though where the observer is, relative to the observer, the plane is moving around and, there's reflections from other objects. So it actually does spatialize the sound a little bit. If you want to know more about that, you can watch the videos I've done on the comb filter, the Supercomb filter. I mean, these can be controlled as well depending on the mapping. So I could change the pitch of that in the mapping and I could change the mix level. But the main, this part, for example, is applied to the flyby pitch right here, about 88% of it. So if I take the lag off this, and just have it moving just as fast as the actual pitch. You can hear it's a bit funny. 500 is pretty decent, that's 500 milliseconds. So I'll just change this back. And finally, the effect module is an etherizer to give a just, a bit of reflections, just high passed. Just to give a bit of atmosphere there. It's not really anything particular. So what else is happening in the mapping is that we've got the actual noise frequency is shifting up from 300 to 1200, 1300. So if we just demo that quickly. The Q is not very high, so it's very subtle. So I could, for example, change the timbre of the propeller sound by editing any of these. So that's another aspect of the Supercomb, was this little resonance coming through, which it gives it like a metallic sound I really liked, but of course it can really push that into another area where we can just add a really strange, whistling sound perhaps. might have heard some, helicopter sound in there, maybe motorbike, maybe a lawnmower, pretty much any sort of rotary sort of propeller blade sound can be really emulated with this. So this workflow is really useful. So that concludes the first part of the propeller video. I hope you enjoyed it. It's been super fun. In the next videos, we'll look at a bit closer at the actual waveforms, and we'll also look at the methods used in Purr data, or from now on it's called Purr data, because there's a new release that I found. It was released earlier this year called Purr data, and ironically we'll be looking at like purring sounds, like the propeller sound. So if you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe with the bell to receive monthly updates. Yeah, let me know your thoughts below, leave a comment and a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time.